The masks came off at midnight. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Every year, on the last stroke of 12, the Hale Foundation Masquerade Ball shed its mystery. And the guests, most of them powerful enough to buy small countries, laughed at the theatrical reveal and moved on to the champagne. Cassidy Hale had attended every single one of these balls since she was 17 years old. She knew every beat of the night. The string quartet that played too loud in the first hour and too soft in the second. The way the east chandelier flickered once around 11. The exact spot near the French doors where the draft from outside was strong enough to remind you that the real world still existed. She knew all of it. She was bored by all of it. Which was exactly why, when Petra, her oldest friend and most reliable source of terrible ideas, leaned in at 9:30 and whispered the proposal, Cassidy said yes before she'd even finished hearing it. "Pick someone," Petra said, her eyes bright behind her gold filigree mask. "Someone unexpected. Someone you'd never talk to at one of these things. Dance with her. Actually, talk to her. And let's see if the great Cassidy Hale is capable of being surprised." It was a stupid dare. Cassidy knew it was a stupid dare. She accepted it anyway. Her eyes moved across the ballroom with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms. And they stopped, almost involuntarily, on a woman standing near the far wall. Black dress. Simple mask. A glass of wine held loosely in one hand, and an expression that could only be described as unbothered. Not shy. Not overwhelmed. Just elsewhere. Present in body. Absent in interest. Cassidy tilted her head. "Her," she said. Petra nearly choked on her champagne. What happened in the next 2 hours would rearrange something inside Cassidy Hale that she hadn't even known was out of place. And when the clock struck 12 and the masks came off, and she finally saw the face of the woman she'd spent the evening falling for, the ballroom didn't disappear. She did. If you've ever misjudged someone completely, and then had to sit with that, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when those masks come off. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been truly surprised by someone you thought you had completely figured out? The Hale Foundation Masquerade Ball was, by any measurable standard, the most important social event of the New York philanthropic calendar. 300 guests, a restored Gilded Age ballroom on the Upper East Side, a guest list that read like a merger document, old money beside new money beside the kind of money that didn't need an adjective. Every year the foundation raised enough in a single evening to fund 3 hospitals and a wing of the Metropolitan Museum, and every year the newspapers called it an evening of extraordinary generosity, which was technically true, and also completely missed the point. The point was power. The point was always power. Cassidy Hale understood this the way she understood breathing. Not because she'd been taught it, but because she'd been born into it. She was 29 years old, the only child of Diane Hale, and she had sat at this particular table long enough to know every card in the deck. She knew which guests were genuine and which were performing. She knew which handshakes to hold a beat longer and which to release quickly. She knew, without looking at the seating chart, exactly where she was supposed to be at every moment of the evening. What she did not know, what she could not have anticipated, was that by 10 o'clock, she would be standing near the east wall of the ballroom, completely forgetting to be strategic about anything. But that came later. At 9:15, she was at the champagne table with Petra Winslow, who had been her closest friend since their second year at Columbia, and who possessed in equal measure the best instincts of anyone Cassidy knew and the absolute worst impulse control. Petra was wearing an emerald gown that was arguably too much for the occasion and entirely correct for Petra, and she was scanning the room the way she always did, not for opportunity, but for entertainment. "You look like you're calculating tax returns," Petra said, handing Cassidy a fresh glass. "I'm networking." "You're performing networking," There's a difference. Petra tilted her head toward the crowd. You haven't actually talked to anyone new tonight. I've talked to 11 people. People you already knew. Cassidy had no answer for that, because it was true, and because Petra had a gift for identifying the truths that were uncomfortable without being particularly devastating, which was somehow worse than the devastating kind. She sipped her champagne and let her gaze drift across the room in a way that was meant to look casual, and probably didn't. That was when Petra's eyes lit up. Cassidy had learned, over the course of 15 years of friendship, that this specific light in Petra's eyes was a warning sign of the highest order. It meant an idea was forming. It meant the evening was about to become significantly more complicated. I have a proposition, Petra said. No, you haven't heard it. I don't need to. Petra smiled. It was the smile of someone who already knew she had won. Pick someone in this room, someone you would never approach on a normal night, someone completely off your radar. Dance with her. Actually talk to her. Not Cassidy Hale Foundation Director talk. Real talk. And let's see. She paused for effect. If you're still capable of being genuinely surprised by another human being. The silence between them lasted approximately 4 seconds. That's a ridiculous dare, Cassidy said. Completely, Petra agreed. Cassidy set down her glass, smoothed the front of her navy gown, and let her eyes move across the room one more time. Slowly, deliberately, the way she approached every decision that mattered. They stopped at the far wall. Black dress, simple mask. A woman standing alone, not with the particular misery of someone who wished they weren't alone, but with the easy stillness of someone who had chosen it. She held her wine glass loosely. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at the ceiling, at the plasterwork, specifically, as though she was evaluating it. Her, Cassidy said. Petra made a sound that was not quite a word. Cassidy was already moving. Cassidy Hale had approached a great many people in her life with the specific intention of being charming, and she had never once failed at it. This was not arrogance. It was simply a pattern she had observed, the way one observes weather. She knew how to enter a conversation. She knew how to make someone feel seen without actually seeing them. She knew the precise calibration of warmth that made people lean in rather than step back. She crossed the ballroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to rehearse an entrance, and she stopped beside the woman in the black dress with the kind of easy smile she could produce without thinking. The woman did not look at her immediately. She was still looking at the ceiling. Cassidy followed her gaze upward, almost involuntarily, and saw what she was looking at. The plasterwork medallion above the east chandelier, an elaborate botanical pattern that most guests had never once noticed in 30 years of attending this event. It was, objectively, beautiful. Cassidy had simply never thought to look. It was restored in 2019, the woman said without turning. They got most of it right. The leaf pattern on the outer ring is slightly off, though. The original would have been asymmetrical on the left side. That was intentional. Asymmetry was a signature of the workshop that built this room. Cassidy blinked. She had prepared, in the 3 seconds it took to cross the ballroom, a light and perfectly calibrated opening line. Something about the music, or the crowd, or the champagne. Something that would make the woman turn and smile and become, for the next 20 minutes, a pleasant and manageable social experience. None of that seemed relevant anymore. How do you know that? Cassidy asked. The woman finally looked at her. Her eyes were dark and unhurried, and they moved across Cassidy's face with the same evaluative attention she had been giving the ceiling. Not unkind, but entirely unimpressed. Behind the simple black mask, her expression was composed and faintly curious, the way a person looks when they've been asked a question they find slightly more interesting than expected. I know buildings, she said. It's what I do. You're an architect, among other things. She returned her attention to the ceiling for a moment, then seemed to make a decision, and looked back at Cassidy. She extended her hand, not the way people extended hands at these events, with the slight performance of it, but simply, directly, as a fact. "Rowan," she said. "Cassidy." No last names. That too was different. At a Hale Foundation event, last names were currency. People offered them within the first sentence, sometimes before the first sentence, because last names here meant context, and context meant positioning. This woman had given only her first name, with the tone of someone who considered that sufficient. And somehow it was. They shook hands. Cassidy noticed that Rowan's grip was firm without performing firmness, and that she released it at exactly the right moment, not too quickly, which would have suggested discomfort, and not too slowly, which would have suggested something else entirely. "You're not enjoying the party," Cassidy said. It wasn't a question. "I'm enjoying the architecture," Rowan said. "The party is incidental. They're the same room. They really aren't." Cassidy felt something shift, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment in her internal calibration, the way a compass needle moves when it gets close to something magnetic. She was used to being the most interesting person in any given conversation, not because she demanded it, but because she had cultivated it deliberately, the way you cultivate anything that matters to your survival. Rowan was not competing with her. Rowan was simply not particularly interested in the competition. It was, Cassidy realized with a start, genuinely refreshing. "Would you like to dance?" Cassidy asked. Rowan considered this with the same unhurried attention she gave everything else. Not coy, not calculated, just actually thinking about it. "Sure," she said finally. "Why not?" It was the least enthusiastic acceptance Cassidy had ever received, and she followed Rowan to the dance floor with something that felt, uncomfortably, like anticipation. The string quartet was playing something slow and deliberate, one of those pieces that exist in the specific register between background music and actual feeling. Close enough to ignore, close enough to notice. The dance floor was half full, couples moving in the careful, slightly performative way of people who were aware of being watched. At a Hale Foundation event, even dancing was a form of communication. Cassidy was an excellent dancer. She had taken lessons from the age of 8, not because she loved it, but because her mother had understood early that physical grace was a form of social fluency. Cassidy led with the easy authority of someone for whom leading was simply the default position. Rowan did not follow the way people usually followed. She wasn't resistant, nothing as legible as that. She simply moved with her own internal rhythm that happened mostly to align with Cassidy's direction, the way two rivers can run parallel without either one surrendering its course. It required Cassidy to pay attention in a way she wasn't accustomed to. Not to perform attention, but to actually practice it. "You've done this before," Cassidy said. "Danced? Once or twice." At events like this one, Rowan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't evasion, but consideration. "A few," she said. "Not recently." "What changed?" "I got selective about how I spend my time." It should have sounded pretentious. On anyone else, it would have landed as the kind of thing people say when they want to seem important. On Rowan, it landed as simple fact, the kind of thing a person says when they have actually done the math and arrived at a conclusion they intend to keep. "You were looking at the ceiling when I came over," Cassidy said. "The ceiling is the most honest part of a room like this. Nobody decorates a ceiling to impress anyone. They do it because they believe in it." Rowan glanced upward briefly, then back at Cassidy. "The people who built this room cared about beauty for its own sake. That's rarer than it sounds." "And the people in the room?" The faintest suggestion of a smile crossed Rowan's face. "Less rare than you'd hope. More rare than they'd admit." It took Cassidy a full 3 seconds to realize she'd just been included in that assessment. Not as a compliment, not as an insult, but as an observation. She was being catalogued. Studied with the same careful attention Rowan gave plasterwork and ceiling medallions and rooms that most people walked through without looking up. The strange thing was that she didn't mind. "You disagree with me," Cassidy said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Unusual. Most of what Cassidy said in social settings had been decided at least a half-second in advance. "I don't know you well enough to disagree with you," Rowan said. "I'm just not agreeing yet. Most people agree with me immediately." "I know." The certainty in those 2 words stopped Cassidy completely. Internally, at least. Externally, she kept moving, kept her hand steady, kept her expression composed. But something behind her eyes flickered with the specific surprise of someone who has just walked into a room and found it arranged differently than expected. "I know." "Not I imagine." Rowan had said it with the quiet confidence of someone stating a verified fact, which meant she knew something about Cassidy specifically, or about people like Cassidy in general, and either way, it was more perceptive than Cassidy was prepared for. The music shifted into its second movement. Somewhere behind Cassidy, she heard Petra laugh. Her real laugh, not her social one. And the familiar sound grounded her briefly back into the reality of the evening. She was here on a dare. This was supposed to be simple. "What do you think of the room?" Rowan asked. Cassidy looked around. Actually looked, not just scanned. The chandelier, the restored plasterwork, the way the light fell unevenly from the east, and how nobody had corrected it, and how the imperfection made everything warmer. "I think I've been in it too many times to see it," she said. Rowan looked at her steadily. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you've said since you walked over." Cassidy laughed. A real one, small and involuntary. The kind that escapes before you can decide whether it's appropriate. Rowan's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. They left the dance floor without discussing it. That was the first thing Cassidy noticed. That there had been no negotiation, no suggestion, no polite inquiry about whether the other wanted to step away from the crowd. The song ended. Rowan turned slightly toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace, and Cassidy followed as though it had already been decided, as though some agreement had been reached in a language neither of them had consciously spoken. The terrace was cold and quiet, and entirely empty. The city sprawled below them in its usual indifferent splendor. 10,000 lit windows, the low hum of traffic 20 floors down, the particular quality of night air that only exists in October in New York, sharp and clean, and carrying the faint suggestion of something about to change. Behind them, through the glass, the ballroom continued its performance. Out here, the performance was optional. Rowan leaned against the stone railing and looked out at the skyline the way she looked at everything, with attention that was unhurried and complete. Cassidy stood beside her and said nothing for a moment, which was not something she did often. Silence in social settings was generally a failure of management. Here, it felt like something else, like breathing space, like the pause between 2 movements of music where you understand, briefly, what the whole piece is actually about. "Do you work in New York?" Cassidy asked finally. "I'm based here, yes, though I spend a lot of time elsewhere." "Projects?" "Usually. I just finished 18 months in Lisbon." Rowan glanced at her sideways. "Have you been?" "To Lisbon?" "Once, for a conference." "That's not really being there." "No," Cassidy agreed. "It isn't." There was a quality to the conversation that Cassidy couldn't immediately name, something that distinguished it from every other conversation she'd had that evening, and from most conversations she'd had in recent memory. It took her a while to identify it. They were not performing for anyone. There was no audience, no positioning, no subtext about what this exchange might yield professionally or socially. They were simply two people on a terrace, talking about Lisbon, and it was enough. "What do you build?" Cassidy asked. "Public spaces, mostly. Libraries, community centers, a few transit hubs." Rowan paused. "Things that belong to everyone." "That's an unusual focus for someone at your level." Rowan turned to look at her directly. "What makes you think you know my level?" It was a fair challenge, delivered without aggression. Cassidy recognized the quality of it immediately. The kind of question that isn't an attack, but a correction, a gentle redirect toward accuracy. "I don't," she said. "I made an assumption. You assumed I was successful. Aren't you?" Rowan considered this with the same unhurried seriousness she brought to everything. "Depends on the metric," she said finally. "By most of the metrics that matter in rooms like that one," she nodded toward the ballroom. "Probably not. By the ones that matter to me, yes." Cassidy turned that over slowly. In her world, success had one currency, and everyone knew the exchange rate. The idea that someone might have opted out of that system entirely, not from failure, but from preference, was not something she encountered often. "You don't care what people in that room think of you," Cassidy said. "I care what the right people think. The room is too broad a category." "And what category do I fall into?" Rowan looked at her for a long moment. The city hummed below them. Inside, the quartet had started a new piece, something warmer, more searching. "Still determining," Rowan said. It should have felt like a dismissal. It didn't. It felt, improbably, like an invitation. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply leaves a door open and trusts you to notice. Cassidy looked out at the skyline. Somewhere in the vast lit geometry of the city, people were making decisions that would matter and decisions that wouldn't, and very few of them knew which was which in the moment of making them. She was beginning to suspect that this, whatever this was the kind that would matter. She just didn't know yet in what direction. Petra found them at 11:47. Cassidy knew this because she had been tracking time with the particular awareness of someone who does not want time to pass, which was itself unusual because Cassidy's relationship with these events had always been the inverse. She normally tracked the minutes until she could leave with the focused determination of someone awaiting a verdict. Tonight she had lost an hour and a half without noticing. They had moved from the terrace back inside at some point, settling into a pair of chairs in the quieter northern alcove of the ballroom, away from the main floor and the increasingly animated crowd. They had talked about Lisbon, and then about the way cities breathe differently at different hours, and then somehow about the difference between spaces that make people feel small and spaces that make people feel held. And Cassidy had said something she had not planned to say, that she sometimes walked through buildings her family's foundation had funded and felt nothing, and that this bothered her more than she usually admitted. Rowan had listened without filling the silence immediately after. That, Cassidy was learning, was one of Rowan's consistent qualities. She did not rush to respond. She let things settle. It was, in the context of Cassidy's life, extraordinarily rare. They had been talking for 90 minutes when Petra appeared. She arrived with a champagne glass and an expression that Cassidy recognized immediately as the particular combination of delight and danger that meant she was about to say something that could not be unsaid. Cassidy's internal warning systems activated approximately 2 seconds too late. "There you both are," Petra said warmly, settling into a nearby chair with the ease of someone who had not noticed, or had chosen not to notice, that she was interrupting something. "Cass, you have to tell me. How did the dare go? Is our mystery guest everything you hoped for?" The word landed in the space between them like a dropped glass. Cassidy watched Rowan's expression with the helpless clarity of someone observing an accident in slow motion. Nothing dramatic crossed her face. No sharp intake of breath. No visible flinch. Rowan simply went still in the specific way of someone whose internal architecture has just shifted quietly and completely, the way a building settles after a tremor. She set her glass down on the side table. Carefully, precisely, the way she did everything. "A dare," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. Petra, to her credit, understood immediately what she had done. Her expression collapsed into something genuinely horrified. "Rowan, that came out completely wrong. It wasn't—" "It's fine," Rowan said. Her voice was even, composed, the voice of someone who has had significant practice at being fine when they are not. She stood, smoothing her dress with a single unhurried motion. "It's a party. People make bets." "It wasn't like that," Cassidy said. The words came out too quickly, with too much weight for a denial that was supposed to sound casual. "I mean, there was a dare, but that's not what the last 2 hours were." Rowan looked at her steadily. In the controlled neutrality of her expression, Cassidy could see the precise shape of what was happening, the careful reconstruction of walls that had, over the course of an evening, been quietly left unattended. She recognized the architecture of it. She had built similar structures herself. "I should get back," Rowan said. "I have an early morning." "Rowan?" "It was a lovely evening, Cassidy." A pause, small and exact. "It was." And then she replaced her mask, not the physical one, which she was still holding loosely in one hand, but the other kind, the invisible and load-bearing kind. And she walked back toward the main floor with the unhurried grace of someone who had decided, completely and quietly, not to let herself be seen running. Cassidy stood very still for a moment. "Cass," Petra started. "I'm so sorry, I didn't think—" "I know," Cassidy said. "I know you didn't." She was already looking across the ballroom, tracking a black dress through the crowd, understanding with the particular clarity that arrives exactly 1 moment too late that something real had just slipped through her hands. The clock on the wall read 11:53. 7 minutes to midnight. The countdown began at 11:59. It was always theatrical. The Foundation's event coordinator had a gift for spectacle, and the unmasking at midnight was treated with the full ceremony it deserved. The string quartet fell silent. A single percussionist began a slow building roll. The guests gathered toward the center of the ballroom, champagne glasses in hand, faces still hidden behind their various masks, and the room acquired a particular quality of suspended animation. Everyone poised on the edge of revelation, playing at mystery for one last minute before the night surrendered its artifice. Cassidy moved through the crowd with focused intention. She had spent the previous 6 minutes trying to locate Rowan, tracking a black dress through the shifting geometry of 300 guests, losing her near the east wall, finding her again by the champagne table, losing her once more when a cluster of Foundation board members closed ranks between them, with the oblivious solidarity of people who do not notice they are obstacles. By the time the countdown reached 30 seconds, Cassidy had closed the distance to half a room. At 15 seconds, she was 10 feet away. At 10 seconds, she could see the set of Rowan's shoulders. That particular stillness she carried everywhere, that quality of being entirely present inside herself regardless of what was happening around her. She was facing away. She was not looking for anyone. The room counted aloud. 10, 9, 8. Cassidy kept moving. 7, 6. She understood, in the abstract, that she had no plan. She did not know what she intended to say, or whether Rowan would want to hear it, or whether the damage Petra had accidentally dealt was the kind that could be addressed in the remaining seconds of an evening. 5, 4. She understood all of this and kept moving anyway. 3, 2, 1. The room erupted. Laughter and recognition and the particular warm chaos of 300 people discovering each other's faces simultaneously. Masks came off in a wave. The percussionist resolved into a full orchestral swell. Someone near the south wall let out a delighted shriek of recognition. Cassidy reached Rowan in the same moment that Rowan turned. The masks came off simultaneously, hers and Rowan's both, in the same breath, the same second, as though the timing had been arranged by something with a very particular sense of dramatic architecture. And Cassidy saw her face. The world did not disappear exactly. That would be imprecise. What happened was more specific. The room continued. The music, the laughter, the clink of glasses. But all of it receded to a frequency Cassidy could no longer fully process. Because every available piece of her attention had been redirected, completely and involuntarily, toward the face in front of her. She knew that face. She had last seen it 2 years ago, on a live stream of the Meridian Design Forum, where a then-unknown architect had presented a public library project for a low-income district in the South Bronx, a project that was, by every standard Cassidy understood, extraordinary. Precise and generous and alive with the conviction that beautiful things belong to everyone. She also knew what she had said about that architect in a separate interview 3 days later. Design without money is just a pretty dream. She had been asked about emerging talent in the field, and she had said it with the breezy confidence of someone who has never needed to worry about funding. And the comment had been clipped and shared, and had circulated in architecture circles for weeks, and she had not thought about it seriously since. Rowan Calais looked at her with an expression that was not angry. That was the thing. It was not angry, and somehow that was worse. It was the expression of someone who has already processed the anger and arrived somewhere quieter and more final on the other side of it. "You," Cassidy said. The word came out barely above a breath. "Me," Rowan said. The orchestra played on. Around them the ballroom glittered and celebrated and paid them absolutely no attention. Cassidy stood in the middle of the most important social event of the year, with the sudden, total, irreversible understanding that she had spent 2 years being wrong about something, and 2 hours discovering exactly how wrong. The interview had been on a Tuesday. Cassidy remembered this with the specific clarity that the mind reserves for things it would prefer to forget. The kind of memory that arrives uninvited and in full detail, like a document you didn't ask to open. She had been 27, freshly appointed as director of the Hale Foundation's Arts and Architecture Grant Program, and she had given the interview to a design publication with the casual confidence of someone who had not yet learned that casual confidence is the most dangerous kind. The journalist had asked about emerging talent. Cassidy had named 3 people she admired. Then she had been asked about a 4th, a finalist for a major public commission who had impressed the selection committee, but ultimately lost the grant to a more established firm. She had not known Rowan Calais. She had seen a name on a short list and a project summary, and made a judgment in the time it takes to draw breath. Design without money is just a pretty dream. She remembered saying it. She remembered the journalist laughing. She remembered feeling, in that moment, like she had said something clever. She had not thought about Rowan Calais again until midnight on a Tuesday in October, 2 years later, when the masks came off and the world rearranged itself without asking her permission. In the days that followed the ball, Cassidy did what she always did when confronted with something she didn't know how to handle. She worked. She filled her calendar with the specific density of someone trying to ensure there was no available space for the thing they were trying not to think about. Meetings about the spring grant cycle. A site visit to a community center in Brooklyn that the foundation had funded 3 years ago. A board dinner that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled and accomplished approximately nothing. None of it worked, which was also unusual. On the 4th day, she asked her assistant to pull everything publicly available on Rowan Calais, architect. What arrived in her inbox that afternoon was not a thin file. Rowan had graduated top of her class from the Pratt Institute. She had spent 4 years with a small firm in Chicago before going independent. Her first solo commission, a neighborhood library in a district with one of the lowest per capita incomes in the state, had won 3 awards and been featured in every publication that mattered. The Lisbon project she had mentioned on the terrace was a transit hub that had fundamentally changed how a working-class neighborhood connected to the rest of the city. It had been called by one critic the most quietly radical public building of the decade. The South Bronx Library that had been passed over for the Hale Foundation grant. The project that had been on the shortlist when Cassidy made her offhand comment had eventually been built anyway. Rowan had found alternative funding, piece by piece, over 18 months. It had opened the following spring. The photograph in the file showed a reading room flooded with natural light, full of children at tables, the ceiling a version of the botanical plasterwork that Cassidy now recognized as a recurring signature. Cassidy sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about what Rowan had said on the terrace, that the ceiling was the most honest part of a room, that the people who built this ballroom had cared about beauty for its own sake. She thought about a woman who carried that conviction into neighborhoods that nobody in the Hale Foundation's usual orbit thought to look at, and who built things that belonged to everyone, and who had come to a party she clearly did not particularly want to attend, and had stood against a wall looking at the ceiling with the patient attention of someone who understood, in her bones, what it meant to build something that would last. And she thought about a Tuesday 2 years ago, and a journalist laughing, and herself feeling clever. The file also contained a recent profile. In it, Rowan was asked about setbacks. She had paused before answering, the journalist noted, and then said, "The work is the answer. You build the next thing. That's all." Cassidy closed the file. She opened her calendar and looked at the list of projects currently under review for the Foundation's next grant cycle. Rowan Calais, architect, was not on it. She picked up the phone. Rowan's studio occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, the kind of building that had been industrial once, and was now something harder to classify, its bones still visible in the exposed beams and original brick, its present life evident in the drafting tables and scale models, and the quality of light through the north-facing windows at mid-morning. Cassidy had called ahead. A brief message through the studio's contact form. She was reviewing potential collaborations for the Foundation's spring program and would appreciate 20 minutes. She had not mentioned the ball. She had not mentioned the terrace. She had not mentioned midnight, or masks, or the specific way the room had receded when she finally saw Rowan's face. She had not mentioned any of it, and spent the entire car ride across the bridge wondering whether that was strategic or cowardly, and concluding uncomfortably that it was probably both. Rowan met her at the studio door. Work clothes, dark trousers, a plain linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a pencil held loosely in one hand, with the absent ease of someone interrupted mid-thought. She looked entirely at home here in a way she had not looked at the ball, even though she had been composed there too. Composed at the ball had been a choice. Composed here was simply her natural state. "Cassidy," she said. Not warmly, not coldly. An acknowledgement, clean and precise. She stepped back to let her in without ceremony. The studio was functional and serious, organized around work rather than appearance. Models lined a shelf along the east wall. Cassidy recognized the Lisbon Transit hub in miniature, its lines clean and deliberate. Beside it, something new and only roughed in. A community center, she thought, from the layout. She wanted to ask about it. She stopped herself. "The Foundation is reviewing applications for the Spring Public Spaces grant," Cassidy said, taking the chair Rowan indicated. "Your studio hasn't applied in several years. I wanted to understand why." Rowan sat across from her and looked at her steadily. "Is that really why you're here?" The directness landed without cruelty. It was simply a question from someone who had decided the most efficient use of both their time was the truth. Cassidy held her gaze. "No," she said, "not entirely." A pause. Brief and exact. "Then say the other part," Rowan said. Cassidy had prepared a version of this on the car ride over, measured and accountable, the kind of apology that acknowledged wrongdoing without excessive self-indulgence. She had rehearsed its structure twice before the bridge. She abandoned it entirely. "I said something 2 years ago that I had no right to say," she said. "I didn't know your work. I knew a name and a project summary, and I made a public judgment that affected your funding, and I said it as though it cost me nothing, because for me, It didn't. She paused. It cost you 18 months. I know that now. I should have known it then, but I didn't look. And not looking was its own choice, even if I didn't understand it that way at the time. Rowan was very still. She listened in the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, without softening it prematurely. I'm not here to offer a grant as a correction, or to make myself feel better about something I did wrong, Cassidy said. I'm here because I spent 2 years not knowing I owed you an apology, and now I know, and I can't unknow it. The studio was quiet. Outside, a gull called somewhere over the water. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. That unhurried, evaluative look Cassidy had first encountered at the far wall of a ballroom, which felt now like something from a different version of her life. I know, Rowan said finally. I know you can't. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something more honest than either. A simple acknowledgement that the weight existed, that Cassidy was right to feel it, and that this was where they actually were. It was, Cassidy thought, the most dignified response she had ever received to the worst thing she'd ever said. She left 20 minutes later without the grant conversation, without resolution, and without the relief she had half hoped for. But she left differently than she had arrived. The Hale Foundation's spring review presentations were held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that had been designed, Cassidy now noticed, with the specific ambition of making everyone inside it feel slightly smaller than necessary. Low ceilings, fluorescent light, windows that faced another building's windows. She had sat in this room hundreds of times without once thinking about what it communicated to the people who came to present their work. She thought about it now. Rowan's presentation was the 7th of 12 that day. She arrived exactly on time, not the 5 minutes early of someone trying to signal eagerness, and not the 2 minutes late of someone making a point, but the precise punctuality of someone who had allocated the right amount of time and used it accurately. She carried a portfolio case and nothing else. No assistant. No pitch deck printed in triplicate. She sat up at the head of the table without fanfare and waited for the room to settle. The project was a community center in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the South Bronx, 3 blocks from the library she had built with alternative funding 2 years ago. The proposal was for a mixed-use public space, a reading room, a maker workshop, a small performance stage, and a rooftop garden accessible to residents. The budget was precise, the timeline realistic, and the design was, Cassidy could find no more accurate word for it, luminous. The presentation lasted 19 minutes. Rowan spoke about the building the way she spoke about everything, without performance, without the particular enthusiasm that people manufacture when they want to be believed. She spoke about the neighborhood's residents as though she knew them, because she did. She had spent 4 months conducting interviews before touching the design. She knew which spaces felt safe to the teenagers who would use the maker workshop, and which lighting conditions the elderly residents found welcoming, and what the rooftop would need to be genuinely usable in February in New York, rather than merely photographable in June. When she finished, she looked around the table and said, "Questions?" The other board members asked the standard questions: funding splits, construction timeline, community partnership structures. Cassidy asked nothing during the formal session. She sat at the far end of the table and listened, and watched, and understood with growing and uncomfortable clarity exactly what she had dismissed 2 years ago with a single careless sentence. The other attendees filed out after the presentation. Rowan was packing her portfolio when Cassidy crossed the room and stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to talk, far enough to make clear that nothing was being presumed. "It's extraordinary work," Cassidy said. Rowan looked up. For a moment, she simply looked, that same evaluative attention, reading the room, reading Cassidy. And then she said, "I know." It should have sounded arrogant. It didn't. It sounded like someone who had done the work and was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of social comfort. "I want to ask you something," Cassidy said, not as a foundation director. Rowan waited. On the terrace, before Petra, before everything. You said you were still determining what category I fell into. Cassidy paused. She had not rehearsed this part. I'd like to know if that's still true, or if it was settled at midnight. The conference room was empty now. Outside the window, the facing building's windows reflected a flat gray sky. Rowan was quiet for a moment, that was long enough to feel honest rather than calculated. Then she set her portfolio case down on the table and turned to face Cassidy fully, with the full weight of her attention, which was, Cassidy had learned, the most significant thing Rowan Calais had to offer anyone. I build things that are meant to last, Rowan said. I don't start them unless I think they're worth finishing. She picked up her portfolio case. The foundation can send the grant decision to the studio address, she said. Then, at the door, she paused without turning fully. There's a good coffee place 2 blocks east. I'll be there tomorrow at 8, if you want to continue a conversation we started on a terrace. She left. Cassidy stood in a fluorescent-lit conference room in Midtown and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, completely uncertain about what happened next, and entirely unwilling to be anywhere else. The Mott Haven Community Center opened on a Saturday in May. It was not a grand opening in the way that Hale Foundation events were grand. No string quartet, no champagne, no guest list that read like a merger document. There was a folding table with coffee and pan dolce from the bakery 2 doors down. There were children running through the reading room before anyone had given them permission to, which Rowan had told Cassidy, the week before, was exactly what she wanted to happen first. A woman from the 3rd floor of the building across the street stood in the rooftop garden for 11 minutes without moving, looking out at the neighborhood with an expression that required no interpretation. Cassidy stood near the east wall of the reading room and watched all of it. The ceiling was vaulted and flooded with light from a bank of north-facing windows, and along the upper border of the main wall, Rowan had installed a plasterwork detail, botanical, intricate, deliberately asymmetrical on the left side. The signature of a workshop that believed in beauty for its own sake. A private joke between a building and the person who built it, legible only to someone who had once stood in a Gilded Age ballroom and learned to look up. Cassidy had learned to look up. She felt Rowan before she saw her. The particular quality of attention that arrived at her shoulder like a change in air pressure, warm and unhurried, and entirely specific to one person on Earth. The ceiling, Cassidy said, without turning. The ceiling, Rowan confirmed. They stood side by side and looked at it together. Outside, someone had brought a speaker, and there was music drifting up from the street. Something with a slow, deliberate rhythm, close enough to feel and close enough to ignore. You're going to make me look at every ceiling for the rest of my life, Cassidy said. That was always the plan. Cassidy turned to look at her then. This woman who had stood against a wall at a party she didn't want to attend and looked up at the plasterwork instead of the crowd, who had built a library with borrowed funding because she believed it belonged to people who needed it, who had said, I build things that are meant to last in a conference room with fluorescent lights, and had meant every word of it. Rowan was already looking back at her. 6 months of Tuesday mornings at a corner table. 6 months of a relationship built the way Rowan built everything. Carefully, without shortcuts, with full attention to what was actually there rather than what was convenient to assume. 6 months of learning that being seen clearly was not something to survive, but something to choose. Cassidy reached over and took her hand. Quietly, without announcement. Rowan's fingers closed around hers, with the ease of something that had been decided long before either of them said it out loud. Below, the music continued. The children ran. The woman on the rooftop was still looking at the neighborhood. And in the reading room of a building on a street in the South Bronx, light fell through north-facing windows onto the kind of asymmetrical plasterwork that nobody puts on a ceiling to impress anyone, only because they believe in it. Some things, built slowly and with intention, turn out to be exactly what they were always going to become.